The Witch of Blackbird Pond, Chapter 15, Part 2. Captain Talcott sensed the growing anger in the waiting crowd and raised his voice. "There is to be no demonstration," he reminded them. "The governor comes here under orders from His Majesty. He will be received with all due courtesy." Presently a murmur arose as the first red-coated horseman appeared on the opposite shore. "There he is!" excited voices cried. "The tall one, just getting off his horse. He's getting into the first boat there." The ferry boats crossed the wide river without mishap, and the party from Boston stepped out onto the shore at Wethersfield. More than 70 men there were, with 2 trumpeters, and a band of grenadiers. Kit thrilled at the sight of the familiar red coats. How tall and handsome and trim they looked beside the homespun, blue-coated soldiers. I'm going to point out that I don't think it's a mistake that Spear has mentioned the color red twice within the past 2 paragraphs. She mentions it when the men are starting to load the boat. She mentions that they have the red coats, and then she mentions it again when she says that Kit thrilled at the sight of the familiar red coats. I want you to think back to what red symbolizes and what could it symbolize in this situation. And then I don't think it's a mistake that she mentions it in the same paragraph as she mentions the blue-coated soldiers, the homespun blue-coated soldiers they're representing Connecticut. So what is she saying in this particular situation by using the color blue as well? And Andros, he was a true cavalier with his fine embroidered coat, his commanding air, and the wealth of dark curls that flowed over his velvet collar. How elegantly he sat the saddle of his borrowed horse. Why, he was a gentleman, an officer of the King's Dragoons, a knight. Who were these common, resentful farmers to dispute his royal right? He made their defiance seem childish. Governor Andros had no cause to complain of his reception at Wethersfield. The people kept a respectful silence. The Hartford escort saluted and showed a praiseworthy discipline. As the band rode out of sight along the road, a few fists were shaken, and some small boys hurled clumps of mud after the last horse's hoofs. For the most part, it was a somber group that straggled back to their neglected chores. The magnificence of Andros and his procession had shaken their confidence. They all knew that this haughty man was on his way to meet with their council, and that before night fell he would hold their lives in his hand. Resignation and despair settled over the household that evening, as though, Kit thought, it were the eve of that doomsday that the minister warned of in Sabbath meeting. There was no company to look forward to. William was a member of the militia in Hartford, and John had sent word that he must care for 2 of Dr. Bulkley's patients while the doctor attended the session. In Matthew's scowling presence, the others scarcely dared to whisper. Kit was thankful when she and Judith could escape to the cold sanctuary of the upstairs chamber. They had been fast asleep for some time when they were startled awake by the thudding of hoofs in the road below, and the whinny of a horse suddenly reined in. There was an echoing rap of musket against the door. Matthew must have been awake and waiting, for before the rapping ceased, they heard the bolt slide back. Instantly Judith was out of bed, with Kit scrambling after her. Snatching heavy cloaks to pull over their nightclothes, the girls flung open the chamber door. From the opposite room came Rachel, still fully dressed. The 3 women crowded together on the narrow stairs. To Kit's astonishment, the man who stepped through the door into the light of Matthew's candle was William. "It's safe, sir," he burst out before the door was shut. "The charter's safe, where he can never lay a hand on it." "Thank God," exclaimed Matthew reverently. "You were at the meeting, William?" "Yes, sir, since 4 o'clock. Sir Edmund got a stomachful of talking this day. The speeches of welcome lasted near to 3 hours before he could get in a word of business." "And the charter?" "It was there all the time, in the middle of the table, in plain sight. Sir Edmund made a long speech about how much better off we were all going to be. It got dark, and finally he asked for lights. Before long the room got hot and full of smoke, and when someone opened a window, the draught blew out the candles. It took quite a few minutes to get them lighted. Nobody moved. Far as I could see, everybody stayed right in their places. But when the candles were lit, the charter had disappeared." They looked high and low for it, all over the room, and never found a trace. Was the governor angered? You'd have admired him, sir. You couldn't help it. He sat there cool as an icicle. He knew the paper wasn't going to be found, and he wouldn't stoop to ask the question about it. As it was, he could afford to ignore it. Aye, said Matthew grimly. He had the power in his hands without it. Yes, Governor Treat read a statement, and they all signed it. The colony of Connecticut is annexed to Massachusetts. Governor Treat will be appointed colonel of militia. And Gershom Bulkley? They say he will be appointed a justice of the peace for his loyalty. Snorted Matthew. He thought the news over for a moment. The charter, he insisted. Do you know what happened to it? William hesitated. For the first time he acknowledged the presence of the three women by one brief, embarrassed glance up the stairs. No, sir, he answered. The room was dark. Then how do you know it is safe? It is safe, sir, said William positively. Then we can hold up our heads, said Matthew, taking a long breath. Thank you for coming, my boy. When the door was shut behind William, Matthew turned to the women on the stairs. We can praise God for this night, he said. Now get to bed, all of you. And remember, if there is any talk about this, you have heard nothing. Nothing at all. Do you understand? Can you sleep now, Matthew? Asked his wife anxiously. Aye, agreed Matthew. I can sleep now. There are hard times ahead for Connecticut. But some day, when the hard times have passed, as they must pass, we will bring our charter out of hiding and begin again. We will show the world what it means to be free men. The two girls crept back into the cold chamber and climbed shivering into bed. As Kit lay wide awake in the blackness, some distant shouts, a snatch of raucous, unrestrained singing, such as she had never heard before in Wethersfield, sent her mind back to the days of her childhood. She surprised Judith by a sudden giggle. I know where the charter went, she whispered. The spirits took it. What are you talking about? Judith was almost asleep. I just remembered. It is All Hallows Eve. This is the night the witches are supposed to ride abroad on broomsticks, and the spirits do all sorts of queer things. Nonsense, said Judith. We don't hold with Saints' Day here in New England. Besides, William knows perfectly well where the charter is. I could tell he does. Snubbed again, Kit fell silent and listened to the unaccustomed shouting in the distance. She felt curiously elated. She knew she had overheard an account of serious insubordination to the king, yet in her heart she was glad that her uncle had known this small victory. Now, perhaps, they would have some peace in the house. No, it was more than that. Tonight, she had understood for the first time what her uncle had seen, what her aunt had seen in that fierce man to make her cross an ocean at his side. There was a sort of magnificence about him, even without the fine uniform that made Governor Andros so splendid. Lying there in the dark, Kit had to admit she was proud of him. Okay, I think we have another notice and note signpost here. Contrast and contradiction. I asked, why does Kit feel differently about her uncle at this point? What is it about his behavior over the past day, over the past events, that have made her feel proud of him? This is different than she's felt about him before. Before, she's just kind of felt intimidated and unloved by him, I guess. And right now, she feels very proud of him, and she can see why her aunt fell in love with him. So that's something that I would write down and maybe try and figure out an answer to. It's a contrast and a contradiction.